On the frozen morning of January 1st, 1855, the people of Callaway County, Missouri, awoke to the stench of smoke and something far more sinister drifting over the fields. In the smoldering ruins of the Newsom barn, they found the charred remains of Robert Newsom, a wealthy landowner reduced to bone and ash, with only his gold pocket watch and wedding ring left to identify him. But this wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a senseless act of violence. It was the final desperate act of resistance by a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia, following 5 years of relentless abuse. Her case would shake Missouri's legal system to its core, raising a question no court wanted to answer. Could an enslaved woman legally defend herself against rape? What happened in that barn wasn't just a murder, it was a reckoning. And it was so unsettling that local authorities tried to erase all traces of it. Records were buried, testimonies disappeared, but some documents survived in the Missouri State Archives, court transcripts, newspaper clippings, and witness accounts that paint a picture of horror and courage in equal measure. In the 1850s, Callaway County was the heart of Missouri's Little Dixie, where Southern plantation culture thrived. Nearly 40% of its population was enslaved, toiling in tobacco and hemp fields for families that had migrated from states like Virginia and Kentucky. Robert Newsom was a respected farmer in this community. At 60, he owned 60 acres, a 2-story farmhouse, and 5 enslaved people. Though his holdings weren't massive by plantation standards, his reputation for harsh discipline and control made him a figure of both admiration and fear. Neighbors said his enslaved workers moved with the cautious precision of people who knew the cost of failure. At church, he appeared devout, but he always attended alone, leaving his household behind. In June 1850, Newsom paid $800 in gold for Celia, a 14-year-old girl described in the bill of sale as healthy and of breeding age. That phrase, breeding, was code for something brutal. Her previous owner, William Grayson, sold her due to financial hardship and in doing so condemned her to a nightmare. Celia's trip to the Newsom farm was less than 50 miles, but it marked the beginning of a 5-year ordeal. She was unusually tall, reportedly intelligent, and possibly literate, traits that made her stand out and may have deepened her torment. The Newsom property was both isolated and respectable, a place where screams could vanish into the fields, and yet its owner could still shake hands at Sunday services. Celia was housed in a 1-room log cabin with a dirt floor and no windows, barely more than a shack. Behind the main house loomed the barn, where everything would eventually end. Other enslaved people on the farm, Ben Coffey, her daughter Patty, and a young boy named Joe, sensed something was wrong from the beginning. Years later, they admitted they'd been warned to stay silent about what Newsom did to Celia. And what he did began her first night there. According to Celia's later court testimony, words so raw that the court reporter's hand shook as he wrote, Newsom told her from the start that she hadn't been bought just for labor. He said I was to come to the house when he called. Said I was bought for more than field work and that I'd learn what that meant soon enough. For 5 years he raped her regularly. No one stopped him. No law protected her. She was considered property without the right to refuse or defend herself. But as Celia grew older, she began to resist, not just emotionally, but physically. Her story would force Missouri to confront a horrifying question. It had long avoided what happens when the law that protects ownership collides with the humanity of the enslaved. Celia's case would reveal contradictions buried at the heart of American law and morality. And the events of one freezing January morning would ignite a legal firestorm, one that the state tried to smother, but could never fully extinguish. By day, Robert Newsom played the part of a devout and respected Christian farmer, tending to his fields, conducting business in town, and upholding friendly relations with his neighbors. But each night after his daughters had gone to bed, and the other enslaved people had been warned to stay out of sight, he would summon Celia to the main house. These late-night visits were not mere suspicions. They became a grim pattern of exploitation and control. In 1852, at just 16 years old, Celia gave birth to her first child, a boy whose pale green eyes and distinct chin unmistakably mirrored Newsom's. Though his daughters Virginia and Mary would later claim ignorance, neighbors found it hard to believe they hadn't noticed the signs of pregnancy in their own home. The methods Newsom used to maintain this cruel arrangement were as insidious as the abuse itself. He kept a detailed ledger, tracking the behavior of every enslaved person on the farm, documenting every misstep imagined or real. It became a weapon, a psychological threat used to silence not only Celia, but anyone who might dare to show her sympathy. Ben, the oldest enslaved man on the farm, testified that Newsom warned him directly. "What happens in this house after dark is nobody's business but mine. Anyone who makes it their business will find themselves sold downriver faster than they can say goodbye." In Missouri, being sold downriver meant near certain death on the brutal cotton or sugar plantations of the Deep South. The isolation of the Newsom property further enabled these abuses. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, too far to hear screams or see what went on behind the thick grove of trees that shielded the slave quarters from the road. The house itself had a vantage point that let Newsom see anyone coming long before they reached the property. This was no accident. The farm's design created a private prison. By 1853, Celia bore a second child. A daughter who, like the first, carried Newsom's unmistakable features. Around this time, local minister John Hammond observed a disturbing satisfaction in Newsom. He seemed unusually pleased with his domestic situation and never expressed interest in remarrying, a fact the Reverend found odd for a relatively young widower. But Newsom didn't need a wife. He believed he had all he needed at home. The law provided no escape. Under Missouri statutes, enslaved people were property, not persons, and the idea of a white man raping a black woman who was legally his property was considered impossible. An enslaved woman could not legally withhold consent because the law didn't recognize that she had any to begin with. This legal void gave Newsom absolute power, and he used it with growing boldness. Neighbors noted how he paraded Celia through town like a prized possession, buying her expensive fabric-fine ribbons and soaps far beyond what was typical for an enslaved person. The prolonged abuse left visible emotional scars. Coffee, who worked in the house, recalled Celia as increasingly withdrawn and fearful, especially when the daughters were away. She said the house would become shrouded in a suffocating stillness, as if death itself had moved in. And perhaps the most disturbing part of it all was that Newsom genuinely believed he was a good master. His daughters recalled how he often justified his treatment of Celia by claiming he cared for his slaves better than others did. In his mind, the clothing, the food, even the forced pregnancies were forms of kindness. But by late 1854, something in Celia began to change. Witnesses would later remember a new fire in her demeanor. Less fear, more resolve. She asked questions about the law, things no enslaved person was expected to know or even discuss. Coffee remembered her asking once if someone could be punished for defending themselves when the law refused to. These weren't idle thoughts. Celia was pregnant again, carrying a third child by the man who had enslaved and violated her since she was 14. And she had reached her limit. As winter gripped Callaway County with bone-deep cold, and snowstorms cut off farms from the outside world, Celia made a choice. On New Year's night, beneath a sky cloaked in silence and snow, she acted. The weather would help conceal what happened and delay discovery. But those final days of 1854 were marked by a transformation in her spirit, a shift from silent victim to a woman ready to reclaim what little power she could in a world that denied her humanity. Ben would later recall that in the final days of December, Celia's questions took on a strange, new urgency. She asked about the burn rate of various materials, how heat affected wooden structures, and what fire did to bones. At the time, he assumed her curiosity was related to tending fires during the brutal winter. But in hindsight, it was clear she was planning something far more deliberate. Coffee, too, noticed changes. Celia had started gathering odd items, pieces of rope, bits of metal, bundles of dry hay, and pine pitch. When asked, she explained it away as emergency preparations in case a storm stranded the household. Given the ferocity of the weather, no one pushed further. What later emerged in court, however, revealed that Celia had been methodically preparing for months, formulating a plan to reclaim what the law denied her: protection, justice, and autonomy. Somehow she had accessed legal texts, possibly from Newsom's own library, and understood that under Missouri law, she could not be recognized as a victim. As property, she had no right to refuse her owner, no standing to accuse him, and no legal shield from rape. Her only hope lay not in the courts, but in reclaiming power by force. The final catalyst came when Newsom announced his daughters would be away for the New Year holiday, leaving him alone on the farm for nearly a week. For Celia, now visibly pregnant with her third child, that announcement was a warning of what was to come. On December 30th, she took a bold and dangerous step. She confronted Newsom in the kitchen and asked him to stop his nightly visits, citing her pregnancy and fragile health. It was a staggering act of defiance. Coffee, who was nearby, heard raised voices and entered to find Celia on the floor, blood on her lip, and Newsom towering over her in fury. "You don't make demands in my house," he growled. "You'll do as you're told, or learn what real punishment looks like." That night, with temperatures plunging, he summoned her to his bedroom again. According to Celia's later testimony, what happened was the most violent assault she had endured in 5 years. But something had changed. She was no longer broken. She had decided that this would be the last time. The next evening, New Year's Eve, 1854, brought with it a cold so deep it seemed to freeze the very air. The wind roared through the trees, and thick frost covered every window in the house. It was a night made for isolation and for action. Celia, who had spent the day moving with calm precision, was putting the final pieces of her plan into place. Newsom, meanwhile, was agitated. Ben noted that he had been drinking heavily, not enough to be drunk, but enough to unnerve those around him. He kept peering out the window, perhaps hoping his daughters might return early. But the weather made that impossible. As darkness fell, Celia continued her daily chores with an eerie stillness. Coffee noticed that she had adjusted the placement of firewood near the hearth, moved oil lamps, and made multiple trips to the barn under the pretense of caring for livestock. These small, seemingly harmless tasks masked her true intent. Around 8:00 p.m., Newsom sent the other enslaved people to their quarters. Ben, Coffee Patey, and young Joe obeyed, retreating to the cramped cabin where they gathered near the fire and tried not to think about what was happening inside the house. For years, the thick walls and howling wind had muffled the horrors within. But this night sounded different. Coffee would later testify that the usual sounds of forced encounters, rhythmic and muffled, were absent. Instead, the silence was punctuated by thuds shifting furniture and what sounded like breaking crockery. Something was unfolding that didn't match the familiar nightmarish routine. Celia wasn't submitting. She was resisting. And by dawn, the entire Newsom farm in the state of Missouri would be facing the consequences of what she had done. At around 10:00 p.m., Coffee recalled hearing Robert Newsom's voice rise, not in his usual controlled anger, but in a tone of surprise she had never heard during his nightly assaults. This was followed by a long silence that stretched nearly an hour, unnerving her. The absence of sound was more alarming than the usual noises of abuse, suggesting that something extraordinary and terrifying was unfolding inside the house. What we know of those hours comes largely from Celia's own later testimony, delivered months afterward in a packed Callaway County courtroom. Celia recounted that when Newsom summoned her to his bedroom that night, she did not comply as she had for 5 years. "I told him I couldn't bear it anymore," she testified, her voice steady. "I said the baby I was carrying might not survive if he kept forcing himself on me. I begged him to wait until after the birth to show some Christian mercy." Newsom's response was swift and brutal. He struck her across the face, but instead of submitting, Celia rose and faced him for the first time with open defiance. "I looked him in the eye and told him that if he touched me again, I would defend myself," she said. "I didn't care what the law allowed him to do. There had to be some limit to what one human being could endure from another." What followed escalated beyond his usual brutality. Newsom grabbed her by the throat, threatening that she would submit or die, and that her death could be blamed on complications of pregnancy. But Celia had anticipated this. She had spent months preparing concealing a heavy iron poker near the fireplace. As he choked her and her vision began to fade, she reached for the poker and struck him across the temple with enough force to render him unconscious. The sound of his body hitting the floor, she later testified, was unlike anything she had ever heard. A sudden silence where five years of terror had once filled the air. When she confirmed he was dead, his skull fractured and eyes fixed in a lifeless stare. Celia faced a terrifying new reality. She had killed a white man in Missouri, a crime that would almost certainly result in her execution, regardless of the circumstances. Rather than panic, Celia immediately moved into the next phase of her plan, a meticulous execution of what she had been preparing for weeks. 6 months pregnant, bruised and exhausted, she began moving Newsom's body from the bedroom to a location where it could be destroyed. Using sheets and rope strategically placed earlier, she wrapped the corpse and dragged it down the stairs and toward the barn. The barn had been prepped for this moment. Hay and firewood were arranged to facilitate rapid combustion, and Celia had gathered pine-pitch dried corn stalks and even fine fabrics Newsom had purchased for her, anything that would burn hot and fast enough to erase evidence. Coffee, the only witness who saw glimpses of the aftermath from the slave quarters, reported unusual flickering lights in the barn after midnight, far brighter and more active than a single lantern. Around 2 a.m., a horrifying odor drifted across the farm. Coffee described it as vaguely like hog butchering in the fall, yet sweeter and more sickening. The fire burned intensely, but with precision. It was not a reckless blaze. It was carefully controlled, designed to consume evidence, while leaving the barn itself largely intact to suggest an accidental fire. The sophistication of the destruction indicated that Celia had not only studied Missouri's laws, but had learned enough about fire and combustion to execute a plan that was both desperate and astonishingly calculated. By dawn on January 1st, 1855, the fire in the Newsom barn had burned itself out, leaving the charred timbers and ash of what looked at first glance like a tragic accident. The interior was gutted with remnants of feed and equipment blackened and destroyed. To an untrained eye, it could have seemed the blaze started from a careless lantern or a stray spark quickly consuming the dry materials. But Celia's plan went far beyond destroying evidence. She needed a story to explain her master's absence. When the other enslaved people emerged that morning, they found her calmly preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. When Ben asked about Newsom, she replied that he had gone into town early to conduct business despite the holiday and bitter weather. For a few hours, her story seemed plausible, but suspicion quickly arose. The first to arrive was Thomas Schultman, a neighboring farmer, intending to discuss a land transaction. Finding only Celia in the house, he became uneasy, prompting a closer inspection of the burned barn. Ben later testified that under Schultman's questioning, he admitted he had not actually seen Newsom leave, and that the master's horse was still in its stall. More damning, Newsom's heavy winter coat hung untouched on its hook, a coat no one would leave behind for a business trip in sub-zero temperatures. As more neighbors arrived, drawn by news of the mysterious fire, and the absent master Celia faced relentless interrogation. Their scrutiny intensified when Schultman and two other men conducted a thorough search of the barn ruins. Among the ash and debris, they discovered fragments of human bone and teeth alongside Robert Newsom's gold pocket watch. Its face was cracked, but the engraved initials RN remained legible, a chilling confirmation of murder. Faced with incontrovertible evidence, Celia's next move would forever mark her place in Missouri history. On January 22, 1855, around 4:00 p.m., shadows stretched across the ash-covered floor of the barn as Schultman held up the charred watch. The other men, farmers, businessmen, and pillars of the county, stood silently, absorbing the horror. Celia, brought under guard, showed none of the hysteria expected from a woman accused of such a crime. Witnesses noted an unsettling calm, as if she had anticipated this moment for years. When confronted, she did not deny her actions, plead, or attempt to shift blame. Instead, she faced each man and spoke with clarity and conviction. Yes, I killed Robert Newsom. I killed him because he had been raping me for 5 years since I was 14. I killed him because he threatened to continue until the day I died, and that my children would suffer the same fate. I killed him because the law gave me no other choice. The silence that followed was profound. Here was an enslaved woman openly admitting to killing her master, using the word rape to describe actions that Missouri law denied could legally occur. In doing so, Celia challenged the fundamental assumptions of the society around her, that property had no will, that a white man's authority was absolute, and that enslaved people could not claim bodily autonomy. Schultman would later testify that his initial impulse was to strike her for insolence, but something in her unwavering demeanor stopped him. Celia was not pleading for mercy. She was declaring a truth that the law had refused to recognize. Celia's demeanor during her confession was striking. Witnesses recalled that she carried herself with a calculated calm, looking at those around her as if they were the ones on trial. Thomas Schultman testified that it was as though she had assumed the role of judge, and the men surrounding her were the defendants. Her account of Robert Newsom's abuses was devastating in its detail. She described not only the repeated sexual assaults that had produced 2 children, but also the psychological terror he inflicted to maintain control threats against other enslaved people. Punishments extending to anyone who showed her kindness, and a system designed to make resistance impossible. Even more chilling was the precision with which she described the murder itself. Celia explained how she had studied Newsom's routines for months, identifying his vulnerabilities and planning her actions for maximum effect. She detailed the construction of the barn fire, the precise temperatures needed to destroy human remains, and the careful arrangement of materials to make the blaze appear accidental. I spent every night for 4 months planning how to kill him, she told the men. I studied his books to learn about law, about fire, about what it would take to make him disappear completely. I wanted him to burn the way he made me burn inside. Her testimony also revealed intimate knowledge of Newsom's private life, scars on his body, his habits, the cruel manner in which he forced her to call him master even during assaults, and his disturbing intentions toward her children. But the most radical element of her confession was the legal reasoning behind her actions. Through months of secret study, she had developed an argument that struck at the foundations of Missouri slave laws. If I am property, she said, then I cannot be held responsible for crimes against my owner because property cannot commit crimes. But if I can be held responsible for murder, then I must be a person with the right to defend myself. You cannot have it both ways. Her logic was so threatening that several men present reportedly urged her immediate lynching, fearing that allowing her to present such arguments in court could destabilize the established social order. The notion that an enslaved person could wield reason to challenge the system that enslaved them was far more terrifying than the act of murder itself. Celia went further, naming a network of people who had aided her. Free black residents in Jefferson City had smuggled her legal documents. A sympathetic clerk had allowed access to law books, and even prominent white citizens had witnessed Newsom's abuses but remained silent. Judge Marshall knew, she said, naming a local magistrate. He saw the bruises on my arms when I accompanied my master to town. Reverend Hammond knew he saw my children and couldn't help but notice who they resembled. Dr. Breenage knew when he treated my broken ribs last spring. They all knew, and they all decided Robert Newsom's reputation mattered more than my suffering. Ultimately, the decision to bring Celia to trial, rather than allow extrajudicial punishment, fell to Judge William Hall, a Virginia-born jurist embedded in Missouri's slaveholding culture. He recognized that the case raised legal questions the state could no longer ignore and sought to confront them in a controlled courtroom setting, rather than leave them festering in the community's conscience. As authorities searched the Newsom property, they discovered evidence that Celia's legal knowledge and literacy were not spontaneous. Hidden in the slave quarters were books, newspapers, and legal documents no enslaved person should have possessed, as well as detailed journals in her handwriting, documenting her abuse and that of other enslaved women in Callaway County. The journals contain names, dates, and incidents, suggesting widespread sexual violence, implicating prominent local families, and revealing a pattern of secrecy and complicity. Questions immediately arose: who had been helping Celia, how far did the network extend, and what other enslaved people might be receiving similar education and inspiration. As Celia was transported to the Callaway County Jail to await trial, these questions hung over the community like smoke from the burned barn. The physical crime had been solved, but the moral and intellectual challenges it raised were just beginning. Celia's trial began on October 9, 1855, in a packed Callaway County courthouse. Spectators had traveled from across Missouri to witness what newspapers described as the most consequential legal proceeding in the state's history. The case promised not only to examine her actions, but to confront the brutal realities of slavery and the limits of the law that governed it. The trial of Celia had ignited fierce debate across Missouri and beyond. Abolitionist newspapers in the North celebrated her as a symbol of defiance against the horrors of slavery, while pro-slavery publications in the South decried the proceedings as a dangerous precedent that could threaten the very foundation of the institution. Judge William Hall, presiding over the case, faced unprecedented legal questions. Could an enslaved person claim self-defense against their master? Did Missouri's sexual assault statutes apply to enslaved women? And fundamentally, could property be held accountable for crimes committed against its owner? Celia's defense team, led by John Jameson, a respected attorney, who took the case pro bono, despite immense social pressure, focused on the state's existing statutes protecting women from sexual assault. They argued these laws made no racial distinctions and thus should apply to all women in Missouri. If Celia had the legal right to resist rape, her killing of Robert Newsom could be considered justifiable homicide. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Puidi, countered with the rigid logic of the Missouri Slave Code. Enslaved people were property, not persons, under the law. As property, Celia could not withdraw consent, making the concept of rape legally impossible. They further argued that recognizing her right to self-defense would undermine the institution of slavery, exposing all masters to potential violence whenever their authority was challenged. Testimony during the trial painted a harrowing picture of life under slavery, revealing realities that many white Missourians had never directly confronted. Coffee Ben and other witnesses described the systematic sexual abuse Celia endured, along with the psychological and physical terror imposed on her and others. Perhaps most striking was the revelation of the support network that had enabled her resistance, a combination of enslaved individuals, free black residents, and sympathetic white allies who provided her with books, legal knowledge, and emotional guidance. Evidence showed that Celia had even made contact with members of the Underground Railroad. Though she never attempted escape, these connections allowed her to study Missouri law and understand the limits of her options. Her decision to resist through calculated violence rather than flight was rooted in this legal awareness, even if she escaped. Her children would remain enslaved, vulnerable to the same abuse she had endured. The prosecution faced devastating testimony from Dr. Marcus Breenage, the physician who had treated Celia over the years. Under oath, he confirmed that he had documented repeated evidence of sexual assault and violent abuse. Some incidents dating back to when Celia was only 15. "I knew what I was seeing," he testified quietly. "But speaking out would accomplish nothing except destroying my practice and endangering my family." The law provided no mechanism to protect an enslaved woman from her master's abuse. Margaret Foster, a free black seamstress from Fulton, who had maintained contact with Celia, offered further explosive testimony. She revealed that she had been documenting sexual abuse against enslaved women for nearly a decade, creating a record implicating dozens of prominent families across central Missouri. Celia wasn't unique, Foster stated. She was just the first one brave enough to fight back. "Every enslaved woman I knew lived with this terror. Every one of them knew that their bodies belonged to their masters in ways that went far beyond labor." Her testimony highlighted a widespread and largely hidden system of exploitation, sending shockwaves through the community. The defense also presented evidence that Robert Newsom had been part of an informal network of slaveholders who regularly exchanged enslaved women for sexual purposes. Letters recovered from Newsom's personal effects detailed arrangements with neighboring farmers to borrow enslaved women for extended periods, often while the owners' wives were away visiting relatives. This evidence revealed that Newsom's abuses were not isolated, but part of a broader culture of exploitation maintained by complicity and silence among the local elite. The trial, already controversial for its legal implications, now threatened to expose a systematic pattern of abuse that stretched across families, farms, and towns, challenging the moral and social foundations of Missouri itself. The prosecution's case began to collapse when they attempted to frame Celia's actions as the result of jealousy rather than self-defense. This strategy backfired spectacularly because it implicitly acknowledged a sexual relationship between Newsom and Celia, undermining their central claim that enslaved people could not be victims of sexual crimes. As the trial unfolded, it quickly became more than a local legal matter. Newspaper correspondents from New York, Charleston, and beyond packed the courthouse, sending daily dispatches that made Celia a national sensation. Abolitionists organized rallies demanding her freedom, while pro-slavery politicians denounced the trial as a direct attack on Southern institutions. Jury deliberations dragged on for 3 days, reflecting the profound moral and legal questions they faced. When the foreman, Thomas Westbrook, a farmer and Methodist lay preacher, finally announced the verdict on October 19, 1855. The courtroom was charged with anticipation. "We find the defendant guilty of murder. In the first degree," he said, voice-breaking, "but we recommend mercy based on the extraordinary circumstances of this case." Legally, the guilty verdict was inevitable under Missouri law. Yet the jury's recommendation for mercy was unprecedented. In a written statement, the jurors admitted that although they were forced to convict, they believed her actions were morally justified and called on the governor to commute her sentence. They also urged the legislature to confront the legal contradictions that had made their verdict necessary. Judge William Hall, bound by law to impose the death penalty, used his sentencing to deliver a remarkable critique of the system. "This court has been compelled to apply laws that reduce human beings to property, while simultaneously holding them accountable as persons when they resist their dehumanization, he stated. This contradiction lies at the heart of our legal system and will, I predict, ultimately destroy the institution of slavery itself. Celia killed her master, and under our laws she must die for that crime. But history will judge that the greater crime was the system that gave her no other choice. Celia's execution was scheduled for December 21st, 1855. Yet she never faced the gallows. On November 23rd, with the aid of unknown accomplices, she escaped from the Callaway County Jail. Despite extensive searches and a substantial reward for her capture, she vanished. Rumors circulated for decades. Some claimed she had been spirited north by Underground Railroad operatives, while others suggested she died attempting to cross the Missouri River in winter. Her ultimate fate remains one of American history's enduring mysteries. What is indisputable is the impact of her case. Celia's trial exposed the brutal realities of slavery, highlighted the contradictions of Missouri law, and fueled national debates over the rights and humanity of enslaved people. Transcripts circulated widely through abolitionist networks, and her story became a symbol of resistance, inspiring enslaved people across the South to imagine the possibility of asserting their own agency even in the face of unimaginable oppression. The long-term impact of Celia's case reached far beyond her own fate. Several of the prominent families implicated by Margaret Foster's testimony faced social ostracism and economic boycotts that forced them to leave Callaway County. Dr. Marcus Breenridge, whose medical practice had suffered after testifying, eventually became an active abolitionist and helped establish medical schools dedicated to training physicians to care for formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction. Perhaps most significantly, the legal reasoning developed during Celia's defense reverberated far beyond Missouri. The contradiction Judge Hall highlighted, treating enslaved people as property, while holding them criminally responsible as persons, became a central argument in abolitionist literature and legal challenges to slavery throughout the 1850s, influencing debates that would ultimately culminate in the Civil War. The Newsom farm itself became a symbol of the case's notoriety. The property was abandoned shortly after the trial. No one would purchase a farm associated with such a scandal. The burned barn was never rebuilt, and locals reported that the site remained haunted by the memory of what had occurred. By 1860, the property had reverted to wilderness, leaving only the stone foundation of the main house as a silent marker of where one woman's desperate act of resistance had shaken the foundations of American society. Celia's story reminds us that even under the most oppressive systems, human dignity finds ways to assert itself, often at extraordinary cost. Her courage challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and to recognize the extraordinary bravery required to resist injustice when the law offers no protection. What do you think of Celia's actions? Were they justified given the circumstances she faced? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling and want to uncover more hidden chapters of American history, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex realities of our past. These stories deserve to be told, and together we can ensure they're never forgotten. I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another chapter that history tried to bury. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.